Welcome and bienvenidos. I'm Cristina Alcalde, Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion here at Miami University, where we're in the middle of recognizing and celebrating Latinx Heritage Month. So I'm very happy, especially this month, but any month really, to be here to have a conversation with Daisy Hernández about her new book, The Kissing Bug, a true story, and I have it right here too, and I know she does too there. The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease, which came out earlier this year. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to those of you who've already submitted questions. We're also happy, though, to take your questions live, and I'll post them to Daisy on your behalf. So you can use the Ask a Question link below the video, and we'll include those questions as we go along. So in addition to being an associate professor of creative writing here at Miami University and my colleague, and being the author of The Kissing Bug, Daisy Hernández is also the author of the incredibly engaging, award-winning memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed, which I cannot recommend enough. Wonderful book. so, um, and also the co-editor of Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism. And of course, I also have that. So, also highly recommended. It's a book that's been widely used across campuses in gender and women's studies courses. And as a gender and women's studies scholar, I've used this in my courses as well. And she's also the former editor of Color Lines magazine. And she has written for numerous other publications and programs, including National Geographic, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Slate, and NPR's All Things Considered, and Code Switch. So thank you, Daisy, so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you for spending this time with me. And thanks to the Alumni Association for the invitation, too. It's exciting to be here.
So maybe to start off, I know we're probably going to have lots of questions. We already had some submitted, but I want to start out. This was such an engaging book to read for all of us who read it and who will read it. And this book, is very much about a specific disease, yet far from simply being a documentary about the disease, it's also, I found, a really deeply engaging personal book. So we learned some about the family relationships that led you to do this research in your previous book, A Cup of Water Under My Bed. So can you share with us a little bit about how your family relationships inspired you to do this work and the impact of the disease that you focus on your family and on your understanding of how families are impacted by diseases?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this book, it is about Chagas disease, which is a parasitic disease. And I first learned about it at home with my family because I had an auntie who was diagnosed with this. And there was, of course, when it's like 5 years old, no one is explaining infectious diseases to me or anything about zoonotic diseases. So but at that point, what my family, the reason my family was talking to me about it is because they were relying on me to actually interpret or translate for my auntie and my other family members. I grew up in New Jersey, just outside New York City. Very typical traditional immigrant family. My mother's side from Colombia, my dad's side from Cuba. And my auntie was, very fortunate to get a diagnosis, but didn't necessarily have the English skills to communicate. So at a really young age, I was actually talking about this disease, even though I didn't know what I was saying. I was just translating what I was learning in school of English. And what ended up happening is that I grew up, my whole life, I grew up pretty much in the shadow of this disease. My auntie was in the chronic stage, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about the disease, but I just want to share about how I was, what knowledge I had while I was growing up, which is, we thought it was a very rare disease. We knew she was in this chronic stage that I thought my auntie would live forever, just kind of managing the symptoms. It was really difficult. There were years when she was hospitalized for weeks at a time, sometimes for months at a time. And then there were years that were really good, that she did really well. She actually was able to get her teaching degree here in the United States. She ended up teaching Spanish in the public school systems in New Jersey. She ended up going on to get her master's degree in the Spanish language. She had a really amazing life. And then there would be these years where she would need surgeries or she would need to be hospitalized for these extended periods. And so many years, I was in my 30s when it was quite a shock to us when my auntie actually ended up dying from this disease. And, it was really in the wake of that loss and trying to understand my grief that I realized how little I knew about Chagas disease. And the nickname is kissing bug disease. And so that's part of the title because it's a parasite that's transmitted by triotomine insects, which are nicknamed kissing bugs in English. And in Spanish, they have lots of other nicknames as well. But when I started researching, I realized, oh my gosh, I thought it was really rare. And there's actually 300,000 people in the United States who have Chagas disease. They just happen to be like my auntie, right? They are immigrants from South America or Central America or Mexico. They often lived in rural communities or had a lot of contact with rural communities, which is how they came into contact with these insects. Chagas disease is a little bit like Lyme disease, which I think is what most Americans are familiar with. You're not going to get it from hanging out in a room with another person. You're going to get it from most often from having direct contact with the insect who's infected. And it's kind of like a sort of like mind-defying disease in some ways. This parasite, once you're infected, you don't necessarily always have symptoms that get your attention. So my auntie, as far as we know, never knew that she had actually been infected. And that's because in those first 8 weeks, when in the acute phase of the disease, you might feel fatigue. You might have a swollen eyelid, actually, where some of that parasite material got into you. But other than that, there's not, alarming signals that something has happened to you, actually. And so a lot of people just don't know and never actually end up getting diagnosed. And then the parasite can actually live in your body for up to 3 decades before you start to experience symptoms. So that's like 30 years of, having this parasite in your system and not necessarily knowing that anything is wrong. And the parasite generally attacks the heart muscle. It can also attack the gastrointestinal system, which is what happened for my auntie. But for most people, the parasite will go after the heart. And about 1 in 3 people end up with these cardiac complications as a result. And so part of like, in the wake of that loss of my auntie, and realizing that there were so many families here in the United States, and then of course in the Americas, in Latin America, about 6 million people who have this disease, I realized there was no book about it, and there was very little material, very few stories for a lay reader like many of us are. I think now, because of COVID, many of us are much more literate in terms of science articles and medicine. We've all become like, a little bit of experts, but there wasn't any book about this disease that I felt like could really speak to a wide readership. And I really wanted to know who were these other families, because while my auntie was alive, we really thought she was the only person who had Chagas disease. And so part of working on this book was like, I'm going to travel across the United States and find these families. And I did. I found doctors very much working as advocates for their patients, who then connected me with all of these amazing families who gave many hours of their time to talk with me about the disease and about how this had impacted their families, including, something that probably, one of the first aspects of this disease that I learned that was really shocking to me was that there's a congenital form of this disease. So similar to the Zika virus, the parasite can pass from mother to baby during pregnancy. And we don't screen for that in the United States. We don't have guidelines for doctors to follow in terms of who should be screened for congenital Chagas disease. And so one of the patients that I write about in the book, Janet, and her husband, Jose, ended up, with their baby born infected with this disease. And her baby's actually very lucky because he showed some symptoms and they had amazing doctors and they were able to get a diagnosis and get that baby treated, because this disease, once it's in that chronic stage for adults, does not have a cure. We don't have a cure for this parasitic disease. But for children, we do have medications that seem to act as a cure, right? These medications seem to be really effective in children, and doctors don't know why it's effective in children, but not adults. I think all of us now with COVID can appreciate just what an incredible process it is for scientists to figure out all these details.
Mhm.
But if we did screen for babies, and we have as many as 300 babies in the United States born every year with Chagas disease, if we screen them, we could actually get them treated so that 30 years later, they're not facing um,
Mhm.
irregular heartbeats and needing, cardiac interventions and even heart transplants as well. So that's kind of what got me started and ended up taking me all over the country. And also I went back to South America to interview my family and other families there as well.
So, following up on that, as you just mentioned, also currently, so much of our lives and our family lives are about COVID. We've been living this pandemic for a while, but as you also point out, and you were pointing to this about, who's affected by this, immigrants from South America, from other places as well. Racial and class disparities in healthcare really go beyond COVID-19, even though that is, of course, what we're focusing on mostly right now. And these have a long history. So, can you talk to us a little bit more about why it's important to understand that there are these other infectious diseases like Chagas that really do deserve attention and education and prevention, as you were mentioning, and funding, even now as we're so impacted by this current pandemic?
Yeah, it's there's so many ways to go about, thinking about this topic, right? And sometimes I like to remind people like, okay, let's just talk about the money, just straight up the money, because that's a huge part of how our healthcare system functions, right? There's a profit element that's involved. There was an incredible economist who looked at just congenital Chagas disease, right? So just this one parasitic disease, this one aspect of it. And what she found was that, if we can diagnose and treat babies and also give medication to the moms so that the parasite load in their body is lowered, it ends up being like 10 times cheaper, more effective, more financially efficacious, as they say, to do that than to wait for this disease to manifest decades later, where then you have to have defibrillators, you have to have heart transplants, you have to have some really serious interventions later. So just from a cost perspective, which I know people, sometimes when I start off on the humanitarian angle, people end up going to the finance, but I'm like, no, actually, it is cheaper. But I think one of the reasons that it's also so important from, a larger perspective is that, the way we think about these diseases really affects public health policy, how we go about thinking about public health in this country. So one of the conclusions that I came to in work, and I worked on this book for 7 years, so I feel like I should say that, I interviewed over, 100 people, families and experts in different fields. And the conclusion that I actually came to, and this was before COVID, I was done writing the book. Actually, the entire book was written and was done. I was handing it to my publisher as the pandemic was being declared. But after working on it for these 7 years, I came to this conclusion that we have really had a policy in terms of public health that's about containment rather than eradication. So that if eradication is not like quick and easy and can't be done, we do settle for containment, right?
Mhm.
And you just have to look at something like tuberculosis. A lot of people in the United States
Mhm.
never think about tuberculosis. It is like not a part of their lives. And where do you find it in the United States? You do overwhelmingly find it in immigrant communities,
Mhm.
and you also find it in communities where people have spent time in
Mhm.
homeless shelters or in the prison system so
Mhm.
that hungry get living. But why do we also find it so much in the immigrant communities in the United States? Because we never made, that policy, those treatments, we never made them available across the world in a
Mhm.
way that was sustainable, right?
Mhm.
So now we have strains that are resistant to the medications that we have. We never really eradicated, and we didn't make a full commitment to that. And the same I would say with HIV and AIDS. Many of us do not think about HIV and AIDS, and many of us think of it as a problem that has been solved. It is an epidemic. And where is it an epidemic? Just in the United States? Because a lot of times we think about other countries with HIV, but it is a huge problem here in the United States, in the South, in Black communities, especially among men having relationships with other men. But again, it's contained to that community. And so that's kind of the conclusion that I came to after 7 years of working on this book. And so when COVID hit, I have to tell you, it was really jarring to see a lot of what I had been witnessing with Chagas, with tuberculosis, with HIV, these kind of this conclusion that I've been coming to then see it with COVID just even early on, to see the testing sites were more likely to be
Right.
opened in white, wealthier communities everywhere from Texas to New York City, and journalists going out into these communities, figuring out, wait, why are the testing sites being opened up in these particular communities? So I think that's something it's important for us to think about, because I hope COVID has really underscored for many of us that, like, we're all in this together,
Mhm.
we need these communities of care. It is not, it's not in our own best interest, if we just want to think about it from a selfish perspective,
Mhm.
to only take care of one small community, or to only take care of one part of the country, or even just our own country, right? Like, it's public health has to be global health.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, I love hearing that because, yes, public health, it's never separate from all these racial and class disparities and gender disparities that you talk about in your book and you were just talking about. And clearly we have so much more to learn about Chagas and about these other diseases, and that's really important. So we do have a question that was submitted along the lines of getting more information about where can we find the kissing bug and is it present in the Midwest? So can you tell us a little bit more about where we can find this and a little bit more perhaps about how the disease is transmitted?
I can. And I also want to tell you that it is really just wild to me that I am here talking to you about insects, because as I write about in the book, when I began this project, I was terrified of all insects. Anything that crawled through the world really freaked me out. Um, and yet I got over that and worked my way through it. I write about that in the book, in part because I wanted to learn more. And one of the elements that was really surprising to me was that we do have these insects in the United States. So kissing bugs, or triotome insects, are
Mhm.
generally found in the South, the Southwest, and all over California. However, they are being documented going further and further north in the United States. But historically, like, where you're going to really find them is in the South, Southwest, because they like a certain temperature. They don't like it too cold. They don't like it too hot. They are very Goldilocks kind of insects. And the insects do function differently. We have a different relationship with this disease in the United States. We do not worry about getting Chagas disease from the insects here in the United States as much. And the entomologists aren't quite sure why that is. Part of it might be the insects themselves, and just how these insects are able to transmit the parasite in the US versus in other parts of the Americas. Some of it might just be the level of exposure. You oftentimes have to have repeated exposure to the insects, and to many of them that increase, just reasonably, like, that's going to increase your chances of being infected. And in the US, a lot of communities do not have that kind of exposure to many, many insects repeatedly, to these particular insects repeatedly. And we also do have much easier access to pesticides. We can go over to the Walmart and buy something that will kill pretty much, everything in our backyard, essentially, right? I'm being a little, silly there, but we do have much easier access to pesticides and other kinds of insecticides. And that said, I always tell people, especially if you're in Texas, the Southwest, the South, different parts of California, the Defense Department, so the US military, has had to think about Chagas disease, and they've had to think about these insects, because the Defense Department has its headquarters for veterinary care for military dogs in Texas. And so what they've ended up, what another part of this disease is called canine Chagas, which means that our dogs can pick up these insects,
Mhm.
or be bitten by the insect as well, and become infected. And they can have, like, a similar situation where they end up actually having cardiac complications, even dying from canine Chagas disease. And the military has figured out that they had dogs that were actually infected, dogs that had died from this disease. And so they've had to go, and this is from interviews with
Mhm.
people who've worked for the military. They've had to go around the outdoor kennels, and make sure that those are sprayed with insecticides. They've had to cut
Mhm.
back the brush to make sure that these bugs, they're nocturnal insects, so they're not going to come and say hello to you during the day. They're going to wait until you're sleeping, and then that's when they're going to be sort of creeping and crawling out to get to you, or to your dog. So I often tell people too, like, if you are in these parts of the country and you have dogs that you keep outdoors, make sure that you're treating the kennel, make sure that you're treating around your porches, and that you're also cutting back that brush. And you also can hop online, and Texas A&M and College Station, they are the leaders on Chagas disease in the United States, and they have put together a really amazing guide for anyone who's in those parts of the country that might be afraid, of having contact with the insects. But yeah, and bug repellent when you get out there to do your camping. And I know some people are like, my sweetie, they don't want to put on bug spray. Bug spray is your friend. You do not, and I can say this because someone who did not end up in the book, but who I interviewed and really appreciated her story. She went camping with her family in Northern California, and she got infected by an insect native to California during this camping trip. And it's very arbitrary, It was like a few nights of camping. Her children were not infected. Neither was her husband. She ended up, for whatever reason, being the one who ended up infected. So bug spray and as much cover as you can have if you're doing outdoor stuff that's what you want to do. Yeah, to protect yourself.
That's fascinating, and to be able to learn all that as I was reading this and then hearing this and thinking, that's right, it's everywhere. We don't really know enough about it. So I have a couple of things that you brought up. Wanted to ask you a question, and you said something, so I'm just going to pose both, and you can decide. But first of all, based on your research, clearly you've interviewed so many different people. But would you say that doctors here in the U.S. and in Latin America, so two separate in the U.S. and one instance in Latin America, really know enough about Chagas, or what are the barriers? Right? Because clearly we need to know more. So what are some of the barriers there? And then you just brought up a story that you didn't include in the book. So then maybe if we can then transition to the process as to how you decided which stories to include and which not to include. But first, about the doctors and the knowledge that they have.
Historically, doctors in the US have not known about this disease because it was really thought of as a disease that would only be found in South America or Central America or Mexico. And, unfortunately, they were not thinking necessarily about immigrant communities in the United States. So historically, there's been very little knowledge. The part where that also becomes really painful is with specialists in gynecology, obstetrics, that they know so little as well. So that has begun to change. Actually, just in the 7 years that I was working on this book, I did start to see that change in terms of at least Chagas disease being on the radar, I guess is what I would say, of doctors. The CDC has also been funding a lot more educational programming. So I went to a pretty incredible symposium in New York City at a medical school there. The only challenge that I continue to see, or that I can anticipate in some ways, is that pretty much everyone in that room was an infectious disease specialist. But immigrant communities in the United States, and I can say this from my own family, we never knew that there was anything. We did not know about infectious disease specialists. We did not know the whole process of, you have a primary care doctor that gets you to these other specialists, right? That was something that we had to find out. And so part of what I can see as a challenge is that more doctors are learning in their field in infectious diseases, which is wonderful. That needs to happen. But those are not the first doctors that immigrant communities will come into contact with. They'll first come into contact with either a primary care or a doctor working in the emergency room, actually, because a lot of what ends up happening with people that I interviewed is that they end up having these irregular heartbeats that become really intense, overwhelming, and they end up in the ER. A lot of times, even if they have access to healthcare through the Affordable Healthcare Act, it's important to remember that actually before Obamacare, Latinx communities in the United States were the least insured community. So that's made a huge difference. But even when they have that, people don't necessarily have the kind of work lives where they can take off the morning to go see a doctor about a little concern, right? They sometimes don't even have transportation. Some patients that I talked to had to, pay significant amounts to like a friend or a family member. These are not, these are people like my parents who they don't have like the Uber app on their phone. They don't even have a cell phone, right? Or they have like one of the old school phones, not the smartphones. So there's a lot of barriers to getting to that specialist, actually. So I'm hopeful that as this disease starts to be more on the radar, that it's going to be on the radar of doctors who are working emergency rooms or are working in community health clinics as well, really directly with these with immigrant communities, because that's a huge barrier. And then, yes, you asked about the research, and It is, you work on a book for 7 years, so not everything that you find is going to end up in the book. I was very lucky that I had already, worked for many years as a journalist before I came into higher education. My first career was in journalism and publishing, and so I already knew that, if you want to write, and I say this to my students all the time now, I'm telling them that they're writing these 800-word essays in creative nonfiction classes, and they're always like working towards the 800 words, and I'm always telling them, no, you actually want to have like 2,000 words and then cut it back to 800. And from a journalism perspective, you need enough material for a 3,000 words when all you have is 800 words. So I was lucky that I knew that, like I had that kind of sort of very fundamental knowledge of journalism. So in terms of transferring it to a book, I knew that I basically needed material, probably for 3 books so that I could have, what I actually needed for this book. But it was difficult, it was difficult, especially there's a whole part of the book that is the patient stories, is these experiences from different patients across the United States. And I had to make some really hard decisions. And part of it was, some of it was actually the patients themselves, how much they were willing to share with me, because in order to write a book like this isn't this realm of creative nonfiction, and specifically literary journalism. So it wasn't only the who, the what, the when, the where, right? I was asking patients, okay, that day, before you got to the emergency room, like, what were you wearing? What were you thinking about that morning? What was on your mind? What did you pack for the trip that you took that particular day, on such a I was asking them the sort of minutia of their day-to-day lives. So some of it really depended on the patients themselves and how willing and how open they were to spend time with me, trying to remember, showing me photos. So the mom that I spoke about before, that was like a big part of our interviews, and our interviews happened over the course of about 2 years. So they were really spaced out, right? And it included, her pulling out photos from that day when she ended up in the emergency room, when she was bleeding nonstop, and what a horrific day that was. And I'm having to, like, make some very difficult decisions about how slowly or how quickly I'm going through the interview process with her, because this is asking someone to re-experience a really, really painful moment from her life, right? But I'm also asking her to show me photos. So some of the decisions were really based on the patients, and then some of it was also deciding, what was most necessary for a reader to really understand the full scope of this disease. So one patient that I include in the book is someone who was born and raised in Texas. She has barely traveled outside of the state of Texas, and she ended up infected with Chagas disease, from insects, there in Texas. And I thought, okay, that story was really important to tell, because it really underscores that although this is not, we don't have to worry in the same way. The CDC has only found
Mhm.
not even 100 people who have been infected with insects that are native to the United States. Even though it's not this huge raging problem, it does happen. And I wanted readers to understand and to appreciate her story and those other 100 people who have this experience. And then I also included stories of people who, one patient who got to the point where the defibrillators were no longer working. He needed a heart transplant, actually. And I thought it was important for readers to see the scope of, like, you can live with this in the chronic stage and actually be fine and not have health complications, like this woman in Texas, like some others. But then there's another patient who, on the other extreme, ends up needing a heart transplant. So the decisions were like, how much they were willing to share with me, and then also like what I felt like the readers also needed to understand the scope of the disease. But it's very hard. In the acknowledgments, I have a lot of thank yous to people whose stories I couldn't include. Yeah.
Sure. It sounds like you clearly spoke with so many different people, and I love how you said that we need so much more material than what actually goes into a book. Because I think often reading books, we don't realize that at that point. So I want to mention we received one comment for you from Connie H. Thanks, Daisy. I've learned to become friends with bugs, especially spiders. So enjoying your talk very much. I first heard you on NPR, and I want to make sure we invite everyone again to please submit your questions if you have any for us, so Daisy can address those. And along with that, you mentioned how long it took to write this book, 7 years. So I'm assuming part of this time you were here at Miami. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how that worked being a faculty member here at Miami, working on this book, what that process was like.
Yeah, it was incredible. I actually think when I arrived at Miami, I had maybe been working on the book for about a year and a half or so. So most, like pretty much all of my work happened while I was here at Miami. And it was incredibly supportive. First of all, because my colleagues were really interested in what I was doing. I think sometimes people think that sometimes people have this image that writers go off into this little room for 7 years and then they come out with the book. It doesn't work that way, actually. Especially, in nonfiction, we actually need to be in connection with others and to feel supported and buoyed, by others over the years. So I really appreciated the support from my colleagues. I had research funding as well, so that I could make those research trips across the country and be able to not always necessarily be crouched, crashing on someone's sofa. Like sometimes I got to stay, and sometimes there wasn't a sofa to sleep on. So the research funding made a huge difference in terms of being able to do that traveling, being able to also go to South America and be able to interview both families and also experts there, and to be able to appreciate their knowledge there. So yeah, the research funding was huge. And then also I teach creative nonfiction, and I always have a literary journalism component or section to my courses. So it's been really wonderful. I'm usually introducing students to that type of writing. And so it was really great to be able to say to them, yes, I'm interviewing someone, I'm asking them to show me photos of their lives. I'm asking them about the weather. I'm going online to match up what they're telling me with what I can find in terms of, if they told me that day was sunny, yes, I am online trying to figure out if that time of the year was really sunny or how hot it was. So also that actually is such a wonderful, I love that we have had that, we have this research or this scholar teacher model at Miami, because they really do reinforce one another. And so a lot of times, when I was telling students what I was doing, it was really, supporting me and underscoring the kind of work that I was doing, and reminding me of how hard it is. Actually, it's not easy to win over someone's confidence or someone's trust in you. It takes time, and my students are doing sort of a microcosm of what I'm doing over the course of 7 years. They're doing in 7 weeks, right? So it's always like an adventure introducing them to this form, and it's been wonderful. It's been very gratifying.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like you have some more advice to give, at least we're hoping, because we have another question from Katarina Palmer, who asked, do you have any advice for those looking to write creatively about Latinx issues?
Yes, I would say take my Intro to Latinx Literature course next spring. but I say that half joking, in the sense that I think a lot of times we forget that in order to do something creatively, we really have to immerse ourselves in what the artists are doing right now. So I would say to write creatively about Latinx issues, it's important to look at what Latinx authors are doing right now, the novels that are coming out, the poetry books, the works of nonfiction that are, to really immerse yourself in that creative practice that's already happening. So I would say that's the first thing. And then I oftentimes will tell people, start with taking a class, some kind of creative writing class, whether it's being given in a community context, or there's so much happening virtually now too, which is really wonderful. And just this past summer, I taught virtually through a nonprofit in Texas called Macondo, which was actually started by this iconic Chicana author named Sandra Cisneros. People probably know The House on Mango Street. She's written many, many other books as well, but people tend to really know that one because it's sold millions and millions of copies and was translated into many, many languages around the world. But she started this this nonprofit. Essentially, it's a writing workshop that happens every year, and she started it because she wanted there to be a space for people both Latinx writers and also for people who were community advocates or community activists who needed to have like a space where people understood the kind of writing that they were trying to do. So I always say, immerse yourself, in all the wonderful creative work that's happening. And then also like look for community writing classes like Macondo. I'm also just thinking in Grub Street in the Boston area. I know I'm pretty sure they've had their classes online. The Loft in Minneapolis has also, a lot of these places all went virtual with their classes. The Writer Center in the DC area as well. It's just a really great way, not only to get into the creative work, but also to find like-minded writers. And then my third idea, actually, I have to pitch the Bookstagrammers. And for those of you who are not familiar with Bookstagrammers, these are folks on Instagram who essentially make it their job to let people know about certain books. And we have amazing Latinx Bookstagrammers. I'm going to be doing an Instagram live interview with one of them, with Edis on Friday. If you follow me on Instagram, I'm going to be posting that info. But they are wonderful in terms of like I'm like, wow, I thought I was keeping up. And then I go on Instagram and I find out about a whole slew new set of books that's coming out. So they are really wonderful. And once you connect with one of them, you know how it is. You'll connect with all of them.
That's wonderful. So we have some more questions coming in. So let me read one of them. So this is from Elise Rodina. So hi, Daisy. She says, I just finished the audiobook on my way to campus this morning. Yay. It is so lovely. I wonder if you might talk a bit about how you conceptualize the weaving of your family's memoir with your discovery journey as you learned about the kissing bug disease. It reads like a story, but it's also so informative. Creative nonfiction is a genre I'm curious about. So any tips for those of us who are eager novices?
Eager novices, take my class. Intermediate nonfiction also next semester. I'm just kidding. Well, I would say in terms of taking classes, actually specifically with creative nonfiction, I often recommend the magazine called Creative Nonfiction teaches classes online. I have taken them myself and I think they are fantastic. They're often also taught asynchronously. So for those of us, all of us who work crazy hours, it can be really wonderful in terms of taking the class at your own pace. And I'm not promoting it, for any other reason other than like I've done it myself as a student, and those classes have been wonderful. So Creative Nonfiction magazine, look it up; it's fantastic. And yes, thank you so much for saying about this, the weaving together of the memoir. I love how you said it there, the memoir and the discovery journey, because that was so important to me. But I will be honest with you, when we first sent this book proposal to different publishers, I was actually not planning to have a memoir angle to this book at all. I was so focused on the stories of patients and everything that I was learning, and I didn't know, I was still also like in so much unspoken grief around losing this family member who had been like a mother to me. And we had a complicated relationship, which I write about in the book. My tia Dora was incredible and beautiful in many ways, but she did not accept me being identifying as bisexual, being very out as a queer Latina woman. She didn't talk to me for many years after I came out. So it was also a very painful relationship. And I just kept thinking, who wants to hear about this? No one wants to. Yeah, I was saying some of what my students say to me is like, no one wants to know about me and my story. I was actually saying that as well. And it was my wonderful editor, Macy Cochran at Tin House, who said, what do you think about developing the memoir part of this experience, like writing more about your relationship with your auntie? And I will be forever grateful to her, because I think that helped me actually to develop the voice that I needed to use when I was writing about the science, when I was writing about the stories of other families. I think it was so important to first have the memoir aspect to the book. And that said, it was really hard. I think it was like the 11th hour when my editor and I finally realized what the structure of the book would be. So I had chapters and chapters that were done, and they were in a really different order than what you heard on that audiobook. At the last moment possible, it just and so we have an MFA program in creative writing. And a lot of times my graduate students are very worried about the structure of their thesis, which is going to be like their book manuscript. And I say to them, we can make up a structure together right now, and I can guarantee that it will be different by the time that you get to the end of this project. Years from now, it'll be really different. Or we can just get you into the writing, get you on, writing, generating the material that you're going to be working with and shaping and molding, because it's not about first drafts, right? It's about shaping that. Well, it's more like shaping draft number 17 into something. And I tell them, and I really use my experience with this book as an example. Like, the structure will come. I now have total faith, and I'll, in order to qualify that, I'll also say that I spent months. I can't even tell you how many months I spent with, like, studying the structure in other books, post-it notes all over the walls in my little office, trying to figure out what would work. And then it just finally came together. I think, like, sort of all that work finally just one day, literally, like, one day I sat down and I was like, wait, I could do this. But I will say that the moment, when I realized the structure, was realizing that, or was appreciating that I wanted readers to understand parts of the disease, before I got to the experiences of other families, so that the reader had that knowledge, before we got to their stories, but that the reader could still experience, kind of growing up with this disease and not knowing a lot about it. So I was making some very strategic decisions, but it took time. It's like, there's a reason it took 7 years, and that's one of those reasons, was figuring out the structure.
And so much of what you're saying is both about the structure and bringing in so many different genres, so many different areas, disciplines even. And so we have a question again from Katarina, and she's a Latina biochem pre-med student interested in infectious diseases and, excuse me, and their intersection with sociological issues. So she mentioned she's done a lot of independent research on Chagas disease and looks forward to reading your book. That's great. For more in-depth look. And she wants to know if there are any Miami resources that you know of for STEM lab research related to these sort of illnesses, or any advice you may have for people in her situation.
Yeah, I'm gonna let's talk on email. But I'm gonna be speaking with a class, I think next week. Yeah, next Tuesday, a class at Miami about Chagas disease. So there are resources in terms of
Mhm.
classes that are being taught with the focus on global health. And as you know, our students, or as you might know, maybe you don't know, but yeah, our students in public health have been just incredible in terms of, like, also working with our campus community on
Mhm.
COVID. This past, I guess it's almost going to be 2 years. It's incredible. So there are resources. I'm not on the STEM side. I am on the humanities side. So I'm not familiar, like, in terms of other illnesses and in terms of other work that's happening. In the US, a lot of the work has happened at places, in terms of academics, has happened at places like Texas A&M. There's also a school of tropical medicine down in Houston at Baylor College. So I could definitely point you in those directions. They've done a lot of work on Chagas. At the University of Miami in Southern Florida, the medical school there has actually sent their students, to South America to get more training about Chagas disease, because they know that they're serving a huge community of immigrants, and not even only immigrants, but also, as you all may know or appreciate, people in South Florida who go back and forth a lot. Their family and their work lives include all of the Americas, and so they were realizing, like, we actually need to have our doctors here trained on Chagas disease and a slew of other kind of zoonotic diseases. So yeah, so I'm happy to, like, point you in those directions if you want to email me.
Thank you so much. And so as we wrap up, your book is about so many different things. And also, having read your work before, you cover gender, racialization, migration, inequality, so many different things. So for those reading this book who have read it or who are going to read it, what are a couple of things, one or two things that you would really like folks to take away from this?
Oh, so many messages. I definitely, I'm pretty ambitious with what I hope people will take. So I have this kind of, like, really lofty goal or hope, I guess is the way to say it, that readers will really think about, um, consider the question of, how do we choose which communities we take care of?
Mhm.
How do we choose which members in our own community we take
Mhm.
care of? And I think with COVID, this is really, really pressing in terms of where the vaccine goes in the United States. Like, I was just one of many, many families that really struggled to get my parents vaccinated because they don't have access to a car, they don't have access to smartphones. So getting them vaccinated, and they're in Florida now, and getting them vaccinated was it was just an incredible, unfortunate ordeal before some policy changes happened. So I really feel like my hope is that readers are going to like look at this and really start thinking about, yeah, I'm part of a community, and so I take care of myself and I take care of those around me as well. Like, it can't just be we take care of our tiny little corner over here and good luck to everyone else. I'm really hoping that this like opens up a different way of thinking about global health. And then I am really hopeful that that this raises awareness among readers who might know healthcare professionals who are like,
Mhm.
hey, you know about Chagas disease? I was reading a book about it. And so I'm hopeful that, for those medical professionals, not only doctors, but also nurses as well, nurse practitioners, anyone who comes into contact with, like, one of the things that a doctor told me who I was interviewing was that, you end up in the emergency room with a young, and this was what happened to him, ended up in an emergency room with a young man who was he was in his 30s or in his 40s, and he was already at the start of like heart failure, and he was otherwise very, very healthy. And he did not know about Chagas disease, right? So he did not know to even consider this. But if you have a patient who is otherwise very healthy and has connections to certain parts of Latin America, you want to be able to think about shot. You want to rule that out. So I'm hopeful that like the book will get it on the radar that there might be someone in an emergency room who thinks, wait a minute, what about that thing, that Chagas? Should we rule that out as a possibility? So I am really hopeful. I feel like that's like very, very lofty, but I'm still hopeful that like the way word spreads that will happen. And then I'm also really, really ambitious that like we will rethink how we deliver healthcare in this country. And I suspect that COVID maybe has changed how some people think about it, but just ensuring that we all have access to healthcare, that it is a human right, and that we think about it as a human right, as opposed to like something that comes along with the job that I have. I know so many people who they take specific jobs because it's going to have health insurance attached to it, and people who have to make certain sacrifices because, okay, I'm going to have health insurance with this job. So I think sometimes people think, oh, the Affordable Healthcare Act took care of this, but no, a lot of people still make some really difficult decisions based on how they're going to get access to healthcare. So I am hopeful that we can like reimagine, right, what healthcare can be like, and that it's a human right.
That would be amazing. I hope so. So yes, I agree with everything you're saying. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Daisy, for sharing all your time with us, and for this really great discussion and all the information that you've provided. And of course, to everyone who's joined us for these great questions, both that were submitted and the live questions and the comments that were sent in, and to the Alumni Association for making all of this possible. We can also share with you Daisy's website, and where you can find more information about this book and about her other books and other projects there as well. And it's right there. So good on screen. And also for those of you who are in or near Miami, I look forward to seeing you at the Across the Divide conference tomorrow and at many other events in the future. But thank you so much again, Daisy, and thank you all so much. So good afternoon and buenas tardes. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Bye, everyone.
Bye.